Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this critical webinar today, The Gaza Genocide as an Expression of White Supremacy and Contemporary Settler Colonialism, and what it means for the more civilized world. My name is Milena Deleva, and I have the honor of facilitating today's conversation presented by the Palestinian Arts and Culture Solidarity Collective, PACSOC, and featuring our special guest today, Diana Buttu, Dr. Muhannad Ayyash and Gavin Evans. A little bit of a background, PACSOC is a volunteer group of arts managers like myself, mostly from the Global South, along with allies in the Global North. And the main purpose of PACSOC is to support Palestinian colleagues at the ON Initiative, which is a new coalition of Palestinian civil society organizations trying to do their work while rejecting funding from governments complicit in the genocide in Gaza. And I would like to thank all PACSOC members involved in organizing this webinar. Mike van Gran in South Africa, Dounia Benslimane and Bish in Morocco, Sverre Pedersen in Norway, and his colleague Ingvar helping us today. We are meeting at a painful moment when the glaring gap between supposed values of the international system and the so-called civilized world and its actions is impossible to ignore. And as we'll likely hear today, the ongoing war in Gaza is not an aberration. It's a mirror reflecting how white supremacy continues to shape the global order. And it's hard to believe for me that it took so long, but after almost 18 months of this AI-powered war, the word genocide has gradually etched its way into the global consciousness, and more people are now calling it what it is. Even ChatGPT, I did this experiment the other day, stopped doing its suicidal act when asked about it. This is against the community rules, etc. And I can't forget seeing a protest in Germany only a year ago when the police threatened to shut down the protest unless participants stopped chanting "Stop the Genocide." And the organizer had to take the mic and proclaim very absurdly, "Please stop saying stop the genocide or we cannot continue." So she had to repeat the forbidden word multiple times. Sadly, the true cause of the time it took for some little shift in the public discourse and continues to take is measured in civilian deaths. And since PACSOC is centered on arts, culture, and civil society, I should add that with the devastating loss of human lives comes a culture side and scholastic side. According to a February report shared by Palestinian members of PACSOC, over 658,000 school children in Gaza have already lost an entire academic year. Over 95% of school buildings in Gaza have sustained damage. And UNICEF estimates that nearly all of Gaza's 1.2 million children require mental health and psychosocial support. Hundreds of cultural and architectural heritage sites have been destroyed, and as you know, the death toll has surpassed 52,000, including over 200 journalists and hundreds of educators and artists. Just last week, filmmaker Fatima Hassouna was killed one day after learning that her documentary had been accepted to the Cannes Film Festival. And since our field often speaks of the power of arts as conduit of empathy, I will close my intro by sharing what has stunned me most about the so-called civilized world. It's selective empathy. Not all genocides are conducted under the white flag, but I'm afraid that in this specific conflict, selective empathy is a function of white supremacy. Otherwise, how can we explain the abhorrent double standard we've been witnessing over the last months? And as the description of this event stated, the genocide is mainly aided by US and Western countries, but as a Bulgarian, I have to admit that with the EU expansion to integrate our post-communist countries, the Western model of white supremacy has also expanded. I see more othering and racism in my homeland, and well, I'm very proud that under public pressure, Our small country once refused to expel its Jewish population, unlike many other countries in Europe. I don't know how popular this fact is. Bulgaria saved its Jews um, who are living in the pre-war territory. And I wish that today we show the same moral clarity towards Palestinians and stop excusing the genocide. That's why I'm here, one of the reasons. And without further ado, now I will hand it over to our interlocutors to address the topic from their respective perspectives and offer some insights on how the Global South generally and allies in the Global North should respond to the current barbarity of many white majority countries. And I'll be introducing each speaker before they take the stage. And following the three presentation, we'll welcome your questions. And for that purpose, we are gonna utilize the chat. And you may actually post your questions in the chat as the conversation goes along. Please be brief, be respectful, be kind, and it goes without saying that no form of racism will be tolerated and it will lead to removal from this call. And it's my great pleasure now to invite our first speaker today, Diana Buttu. Diana Buttu is Haifa-based acclaimed lawyer and analyst who was a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in the early 2000s. And she's a regular commentator and writer on Palestinian and Israeli issues for mainstream media such as New York Times, Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Guardian. But since independent media is more important than ever, I would mention that Diana is also a contributor to Zeteo. She has held fellowships at Stanford and Harvard Law and Kennedy Schools, among others. Diana, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Milena, and thank you all for attending. And I particularly want to thank the organizers. I know these are never easy to put together, so I appreciate the time, the energy, the passion, the love that you put into putting this together. And of course, I also want to thank my co-panelists. I'm very honored to be sharing a platform with you. I wanted to focus today on, in terms of the topic, and Milena, you raised a very important issue about the selective humanity. And it's based on that I want to look back and then move forward in terms of where it is that we are right now. I think that one of the reasons that that this selective humanity has been so stark in the aftermath of October of 2023 is because there was always a selective humanity when it came to Palestinians. And what do I mean by that? You know, the only way that the Israelis could carry out the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the removal of 75% of its indigenous population, the only way that that could be done was through the wholesale dehumanization of Palestinians. That's the only way that it could be done. The only way that Israelis could then become Nakba deniers or Nakba cheerleaders or Nakba apologists, I mean, one of them, was through the wholesale dehumanization of Palestinians. The only way that Israelis could literally take over Palestinian houses and live in those Palestinian houses was, and with everything that's there, right? The plates, the dishes, the food, using the curtains, perhaps wearing their clothes, was through the wholesale dehumanization of Palestinians. And the only way that Israelis could loot the houses of Palestinians in 1948 during the Nakba, 47 to 49, was through the wholesale dehumanization of Palestinians. That was the history part of it. The problem is not just the Israelis. The problem, of course, is that although the Israelis engaged in this massive process of wholesale dehumanization in 1948, I mean, 47 to 49, but 1948 primarily, although they were the ones who did it, it was also applauded by the world. It was applauded by the world in the fact that Israel was recognized very quickly as a state. It was applauded by the world in the ways in which Palestinians, in particular Palestinian refugees, are somehow viewed as being a quote unquote problem. You know, you'll hear people say, we need to address the refugee problem, which means that I'm a problem. This is the way that they view me, as a problem. They don't view the dehumanization as a problem. They don't view the ethnic cleansing as the problem. They view me as an individual as a problem. And the only ways, and so it wasn't just a question of what the Israelis did, but the fact that so many nations around the world accepted and applauded what Israel did. And of course, ignored what that meant and continues to mean for Palestinians. And so from the period of 1948 up until the current day, that has been the reality in which Palestinians have lived. And for anybody who has been to Palestine or who lives in Palestine, you know that that policy, those policies of dehumanization, did not stop in 1948. That was just the beginning. And that explains why it is that the Israelis have been able to carry out not just the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, but to have some form of military rule established against Palestinians from 1948 to the current day. By the way, there was military rule between the period of 48 and 66. And then for a period of like 7 months, 6, 7 months, there was no military rule. And then 67 onward was when Israel's military occupation then began. So you're looking at an entire history of 77 years of dehumanization of Palestinians. And again, that isn't just what the Israelis have done, but it's the ways in which the world has dealt with Israel and treated Israel, and the past that it's given to Israel. And the fact that Palestinians are somehow always viewed as a problem, or viewed as either a demographic threat or a security threat or a refugee problem. That's the ways in which Palestinians have always been positioned. And so it comes as zero surprise to me, absolute zero surprise to me, that in the aftermath of the events of October 2023, that each and every journalist, the first question that they asked a Palestinian was, say it with me, do you condemn Hamas, right? You should have all been saying it at the same time, right? Because we all heard it. We all heard it. Why is it that that became the starting point? Because that became the height of dehumanization up until that point, was that if you don't believe that Palestinians are human, and if you don't believe they're people, that it's so easy that you can ignore all of those 75 plus years of what Israel has done to Palestinians up until that time. It's so easy to just ignore it. When you don't view Palestinians as humans, and when you've engaged in this process of dehumanization, it's so easy to just turn around and say, do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn Hamas? You know, they're asking the wall if it condemns Hamas at this point. And so this was not at all surprising to me. Now, the other step of this is that we have to look at the world now in this post-October 2023 lens as well. And here's where what you see has been happening is not just genocide. And Milena, I'm so happy that you also mentioned that I don't just do work in mainstream media, although I do think it's important, that I think there's a lot of independent and non-corporate media that also has to be focused on. One of the major things that we've seen in the aftermath of October of 2023 is that this mainstream media has actually facilitated Israel's genocide. This isn't, let me be clear, this is an American-funded, Israeli-led genocide. The two are hand in hand. In fact, so much so that when I speak to friends in Gaza, they refer to the Israelis as kind of the natur, the doorman, and that the real person who's owning the building is the Americans, that the real arm behind the genocide is the Americans, and that it's just the Israelis who are actually dropping the bombs. Not to downplay the Israelis, but just so that we're clear in terms of what's happening. But this genocide would not have been possible had it not been for the role that mainstream media, Western mainstream media, has been playing. And allow me a minute to explain. I will never forget nor forgive on October the 17th of 2023, when the Israelis bombed the Baptist hospital, Mohamed Hospital. We had Western journalists after Western journalist, including, and by the way, Human Rights Watch, come out and say, oh, no, this must have been an errant missile from Islamic Jihad. All right. And in this kind of errant missile from Jihad, which killed 500 Palestinians, which we've never had before, they did this without being present, without having the tools to, because they're not there in Gaza, without having any eyewitnesses, without anything. And that alone then paved the way for Israel's bombing of a Shifa hospital 3 weeks later, which then paved the way for the bombing of each and every one of the 36 hospitals in Gaza. And so where are we today? This isn't just the killing of 52,000, and I think the numbers are much, much, much higher than the 52,000, because that doesn't include the 11,000 that are under rubble that we know of. This isn't just about the killing of the tens of thousands of Palestinians. It's about the entire destruction of Gaza. It's about ignoring the statements that Israeli officials have made, that they made from the beginning, when they said the Gaza Strip will be smaller in size and thinner in population. And here we are, a year and 7 months out. And what do we see? A Gaza Strip that is smaller in size and thinner in population, with not one fully functioning hospital, without any water infrastructure, without any electricity infrastructure, with a infrastructure of telecommunication that's been decimated. So many bombs have been dropped on Gaza that it's toxic. There's no way that that food supply can be revived. Where the earth has actually sunk in. They used to talk about making Gaza sink into the sea. They're actually making it sink into the sea. Where we see that policies of starvation are allowed to take place. And all of this is done while we see in the Western media, there's still debates of whether we call it the Hamas-run Gaza, Hamas-run Gaza Medical Ministry of Health, and all of this other stuff that we're seeing. Why am I raising all of this? Because we actually know what the international standards are. And one of the amazing things is that it was South Africa that has brought the case to the International Court of Justice, because they are the ones who are like bringing the receipts and saying to the world, hey, you want us to abide by international law? Here's international law. Please come ahead and implement it. And so the amazing thing in all of this is that as we're watching this televised, live streamed genocide with everybody knowing what's happening, we're still in a world where the West continues to dehumanize Palestinians. And it's an arc. It's been going on from the beginning. This isn't new. This brings me to the issue of the role of funding and arts and civil society. If people think that dehumanization somehow ends at some point, it doesn't. It becomes infused in the ways in which donors demand conditions. and they put conditions on organizations. It becomes infused in the ways in which programs are carried out. It becomes infused in the way of the language that we use. It becomes infused in terms of the way of art. We are now on the cusp of seeing a whole host. We're just at the beginning of seeing a whole host of massive censorship that's going to take place when it comes to everything in relation to genocide. And it's not just it's not just in the realm of donors. The last comment that I want to make, because I know I'm running out of time, is that we know that that there's a whole infrastructure that is designed to erase us. It's designed to erase us. That's the whole height of dehumanization, is to erase us. And that infrastructure is taking the shape of funding. It's taking the shape of conditionality, but it's also in social media as well. I worry about 20 years from now, as we look back on this time, with all of the constraints that have been put on Palestinians on social media, not just in terms of what is allowed to get through the algorithm, but the ways in which we self-censor and the ways in which censorship is taking place. I wouldn't be surprised that if in 25 years from now, looking back, that there's no data of a genocide being perpetrated by Israel, because that's precisely what they aim to do, is erase us. And so I want to end by saying that this is the time is for now for us around the world, and those who are opposing genocide, to speak out. And the one thing that has left me heartened throughout this entire period is seeing the love around the world, a love for Palestinians, a love for our existence. And that has been harnessed, needs to continue to be harnessed. And it's a love that I must say the Israelis will never know. They will never, ever, ever know what it's like to have love from around the world. Never, ever. And that's what lifts us. And that's what's going to sustain us. And I thank you.
We thank you so much, Diana Buttu. Listening to you, and especially the way you described how the Western imaginary and what it projects on Palestinians. And I can't help but bring a quote by James Baldwin, who, as you know, from staunch supporter of Israel after visiting the country, he changed his stance, and he said that the state of Israel was not created for the salvation of the Jews. It was created for the salvation of Western interests. And the dehumanization you were talking about, it's ingrained in the Balfour Declaration, which I only read recently. I thought it's a huge document, but it's like 1/3 of a page, but where the native population is anonymized and referred to as non-Jewish. I wonder if Muhannad, as Palestinian yourself, you would like to add anything or your thoughts on Diana's reflections. You are muted. Ingvar, could you please unmute Muhannad?
Oh, hi. Thank you. I just very quickly, because I know Gavin is speaking next. But thank you, Dan. I mean, that was very powerful and very wonderful. And I just want to say yesterday I was talking to a Syrian guy that was cutting my hair, and we were actually talking about the very last point that you mentioned. And I said, if you look around the world, nobody loves them. And how can you? How can you love a society or a state that commits such heinous acts of genocide for over 70 years, dehumanizes Palestinians to the degree that Israel does, and feel any kind of affinity to it? Everybody who stands with Israel does it out of self-interest. That's it. Their relationships are based on self-interest, nothing more. There's nothing substantive, nothing meaningful, nothing higher, nothing worthy of the ideals of humanity and the aspirations of human beings. It is just pure naked self-interest. And that's kind of what I'll focus on in my talk, but I'll come back to that later.
Now I'm muted. Thank you. And for those actually that joined after the housekeeping remarks, you can post your comments and questions in the chat as we go along, but they will be addressed after each presentation. And now I would like to invite our next speaker, Gavin Evans. Gavin lectures in media law and journalism at Birkbeck College, University of London, as the author of 10 books, the latest of which is White Supremacy, A Brief History of Hatred. His memoir, Son of a Preacher Man, will be published in South Africa next month. And during 40 years of journalism, he has written for numerous international newspapers and has broadcast for the BBC and others. He was born in London, but raised mainly in South Africa, where he was involved in a number of anti-apartheid organizations in the 80s. Thank you for being with us, Gavin, and the mic is yours.
Okay, maybe I could just start with a little bit of background. Now, my father was Jewish, but he was also, rather surprisingly for many people, he was an evangelical Anglican bishop. But he was fervently pro-Zionist. He had come from a family where his grandmother was a founder member of the first South African Zionist organization. His mother was an ardent Zionist, and he retained his ardent Zionism. I remember very well in 1967 him dancing in celebration of the war in 67 and again in 73, and being ecstatic about it and talking about the Palestinians and about the Egyptians running away and leaving their shoes because the Jews were courageous and the enemy were cowardly, which I think in any war one hears about that kind of talk. And his heroine was Golda Meir. So he came from that kind of background, and he had been to Israel and come back ecstatic about what he saw there. But on his second visit, which was supposed to have been led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, but his passport was taken away. So he asked my father if he could take his place. And this was a mixed group, unlike the previous times he'd been when, only white people had been. And when they were in the West Bank, one of the African students who was part of his group said to him, "This is just like apartheid. They're exactly like the apartheid rulers." And he said, no, it's not. And the guy said, yes, it is. He when he came back, he told me the story. He chose to tell me the story. And he said to me, I thought about it for a long time, and he's right. Now, why I tell this that story is because probably more than most places in the world, there are very significant numbers of Jewish people in South Africa who are pro-Palestinian, who are anti-Zionist. And I think the reason is one can recognize apartheid when one sees it, when you've grown up with it. And for many people who were anti-apartheid, they were and the ranks of the white anti-apartheid people, very significant numbers of them were Jewish. They were very well aware of the close relation between apartheid South Africa and Israel, which went way beyond their cooperation in terms of the nuclear bomb. So that was part of it, but I think a large part of it was also recognizing apartheid and recognizing the language of apartheid, because the way the Palestinians are talked about is very, very similar to the way Black people were talked about in South Africa. And part of my research that I've done, as was mentioned, I've done my most recent book that came out was called White Supremacy, A Brief History of Hatred. A book before that was called Skin Deep, where I looked at the faux science of race As part of the research, I delved very deeply into the message board sites used by the far right, sites like 4chan. And it was very interesting. The language was both extremely racist, using the N-word routinely, and going much further than that. Also extremely misogynistic. The overlap there was absolute. And also extremely anti-Semitic, and yet very often pro-Israel. I don't see that as a contradiction at all. You can be anti-Semitic and think that Jews belong in this other place, not in your own country. So there's no contradiction there. But it was remarkable. I mean, if you look, for example, at the mass killer Anders Breivik, a far right killer who massacred students in Norway, he was very pro-Israel. So there has been that kind of link. Now, when I've looked at what, for example, Israeli settlers in the West Bank, settlers in inverted commas, talk about, and the way they're talking about Palestinian people, it's the othering. It's that there's something else. There's something fundamentally degenerate about them, and it's not talked about just in cultural terms. It's talked about as an essence, and an essence that is part of who the Palestinians are. So the othering means that they are violent people, that and any adjectives that are used negatively about other races in colonial situations all over the world are used about the Palestinians. And in many sense, it is a colonial situation. Now, what makes the othering of Palestinians unusual is that, unlike apartheid South Africa, where the colonizers came from Holland and from Britain, and the colonized people had always been there, in the case of Israel, of course the Palestinians have always been there, but that's denied by the Israelis. Many people I've spoken to who Zionists say no, they came from elsewhere, and they sort of somehow arrived at some stage. But that when the Jews arrived in Palestine, it was kind of terra nullius, and that was the original idea. Of course, there was never any truth in that. And I mean, I did also look at when I was doing this research, I looked at some of the genetic studies, one of which showed that, particularly with the Mizrahi Jews and the Palestinians, there was almost a complete genetic overlap. So that we were essentially talking about the same people in what might be called ethnic terms, but people with different culture, different religion, but in that sense, it was closer to what we saw with the Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. So the othering then had to it had to take on a false narrative, the narrative that Jews have always belonged in Israel, and that they're simply returning to a country that they were forced out of, which if you look at Shlomo Sand's book, it was much more complicated than that, and he certainly argued that the Palestinian or many of the Palestinian people were descendants of that original population, which was Jewish. So this idea that they were a population from somewhere else, that they don't belong, that they'd usurped the land that was originally that of the Jewish people, and they were simply taking back what was theirs. In the ideas of the Israeli right, that includes the West Bank in particular, but Gaza as well, because they say that was the land of David and Solomon and the united Israel, which actually never existed historically. So it's again, there are many of the myths that that are used, particularly by the Israeli right, are myths of the biblical myths, the myth of that the promised land of coming from having been promised by Abraham and then to Moses and then delivered through Joshua, and that simply never happened. I think there are very few historians now who believe that Moses actually existed. There's certainly none of them believe that there was any exodus from Egypt. Those are just the mythologies of that all cultures have about themselves. They have foundation stories which are very seldom based in truth. The truth is what the mythology does for that community. So this is an invented history which coalesces with the Bible or the Hebrew scriptures, but is not true. And then there's also an invented history of the Palestinians that they somehow came from somewhere else, and that has enabled the othering that can be done, and that is then used to justify the removal of Palestinians from their homeland in 1948. And I mean, the history now is not, or aspects of that history are less in dispute than they were. I mean, one gets a historian like Benny Morris, who is very pro the Israeli government, in a way very pro some of the genocide that has taken place. But nevertheless, he has written about, for example, the Yassin massacre in April 1948, in which Irgun, the terrorist groups, Jewish terrorist groups, Irgun and the Stern Gang, murdered 107 people, including women and children, and raped people as well. So, in a way, exactly what what happened and set off the war in Gaza had happened on the other side in 1948. But that history is not taught very much in Israeli in Israeli education, let alone in Israeli schools. So people in Israel do not recognize it. It's not a truth that gets recognized because it doesn't fit the narrative of an ethnic state. And so when I'm asked about, well, what I believe is the solution to the situation in Israel, my answer is very similar to the answer I give as to the solution in Ireland, and that is that the two-state solution is dead. That there should be one state, binational state, and the right to return should be extended to all Palestinians who should be compensated for the land that was taken from them in 1948. Now, of course, that's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen in the short or medium term. But that, to me, is the solution. Is not the idea of an ethnic state is something to me that is anathema, not just to human rights, but also in a broader sense to democracy itself. And in that sense, when you remove the majority of the population in 1948, roughly 2/3 of the population were Palestinian, and they had 2/3 of the land, and you remove the majority of the population from the land, it's very difficult to maintain that what you have there is a real democracy. And I think that's part that's another issue that I think needs to be addressed when Israel is spoken about as the only democracy in the region. So those are just a few points I have. And just returning to the issue of white supremacy, the Israelis have been adopted in a sense in the United States, in Europe, and I think a lot of that was guilt out of the fact that people fleeing from the Nazis before the war were refused entry to the United States and restricted entry to, for example, to Britain. So Israel was seen as a way of making that kind of problem go away, and the recognition of Israel, and therefore its acceptance as an ethnic state. And I think part of the narrative has been that this ethnic state is a democracy, and I think that's one of the things that needs to be challenged. The whole idea of white supremacy, and this is what I've seen so much when I've looked into these various websites, is to look at people from other communities as being defective in some way. And that's the way that Palestinians are being talked about. And that is part of the way in which I think the state of Israel and Zionism as it exists today is perpetuated. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gavin. I wonder if Diana and Muhannad have any response to what we just heard and Gavin's idea about solution.
If Diana would like to say something, because I mean, I could just go into my sort of talk, but if Diana wants to say something first.
Yeah, let's make sure she's unmuted because we have this mic issue. Diana, would you like to respond to Gavin? All right, if not, we can come back to that in the Q&A. So I will just plunge into introducing Dr. Muhannad Ayyash, who was born and raised in Silwan, Al-Quds, before immigrating to Canada, where he's a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He's also a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and he's the author of Lordship and Liberation in Palestine, Israel, and a hermeneutics of violence, among many journal articles, book chapters, and opinion pieces. Thank you so much for joining us today, Muhannad, and the floor is yours.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the organizers and honored to be sharing this panel with the co-panelists as well. And thanks to everyone who made the effort to join us today as well. So like I said before, I'm going to focus more on self-interest, because I do think that is actually one of the critical elements underpinning all of this. Let's just start with some basics here. Zionism is a political ideology that was born within the context of European colonial modernity. It is a European colonial white supremacist project from its roots. I've written a journal article on this topic about Zionism and colonial modernity. I've written a more sort of accessible opinion piece in Mondoweiss about it. But the basics is that Zionism proposes a solution to European anti-Semitism by joining the European colonial project. That's its fundamental roots. So it says the solution is for European Jews who will never be accepted into Europe is to leave Europe and build a European-like state in the land of the Orient, and be part of Europe that way. Then the Jewish state would stand as a full-fledged member of Europe, basically, that would be respected as another European state, like all of these European states that existed at the time that were born out of the colonial project over the last 500 or so years. So the notions of racial and ethnic supremacy were rooted in it. And they understood that they needed the aid of a European empire in building this project in Palestine. When they eventually settled that that will be the area of the world where they will go and build this Zionist Jewish state, would be in Palestine, they knew that they needed the help of a European empire to do that. Why? It's very simple. They knew it was already populated by people. They knew that there were already indigenous Palestinians who will not just go, oh yes, okay, I leave my land and give it to you, and whoever of us will remain as a minority and bow down to your lordship. They knew that that's a silly thing to expect from human beings. Human beings don't do that anywhere, and so they knew that they needed force and power to establish the Jewish state, and they knew it was a settler colonial project as well. That only starts to be denied later on after World War II. And of course, most of the Zionist leaders were secular, but they incorporated, biblical mythology into their project to justify what is unjustifiable. They were not returning. All of this is delusional nonsense that I don't really need to get into unless people really want to. But no serious historians takes any of these claims of return seriously. Nobody denies, of course, the presence of Jewish history on the land, but the idea that it's the only history and they're the rightful owners and these are the same people that were removed from these lands thousands of years ago and are just not. This is nonsense. Nobody with a respectable title of historian would argue these things. Because they can't be proven by any evidence or facts. So at any rate, so it involved the elimination of Palestinians, their displacement, their expulsion from their lands, and their replacement with settlers from elsewhere. Of course, the majority were in the beginning were settlers, European Jews, but then after 1948, you had the Mizrahi Jews from the Arab world being moved into Palestine to replace indigenous Palestinians. And by the way, they're just as much settlers. This is not, to base this on DNA and racial and ethnic identity and all that is nonsense. If Egyptian Muslims wanted to replace Palestinians and create an Egyptian Muslim state in Palestine in the early part of the 20th century, that'd still be settler colonialism. So it's settler colonialism root and stem, and that is what we still see today. Now, so I mentioned earlier the British Empire was integral to the establishment of the Jewish state. It could not have happened without it. There's no doubt about that. And after the British Empire's decline, the American Empire steps in slowly. During the Cold War in the 60s and 70s, that connection solidifies. And now it's extremely strong. So what does the empire gain from this? The empire gains from this tremendously. European empires have always operated on just to sort of simplify it, a divide and conquer strategy, leaving the colonized in a weakened, fragmented, chaotic state. In order to, just to oversimplify, steal their shit from them. And that's what they've always done in very complex ways. Don't get me wrong, but that is the kind of core of what they've done. And they saw the idea of a European Jewish state in Palestine as a critical imperial outpost. They knew that such a state would be entirely dependent on the British to exist. They knew that it would not be welcomed by the indigenous inhabitants and the wider region. They knew that there would be massive resistance to it. They knew that, therefore, if they helped it prop itself up and become a player in the region and so on and so forth, that it would be forever entirely dependent on them. It could not survive a hostile region, which is hostile to it because of what it's doing to them. So it is the aggressor, but they knew that it would be hostile, that it could only exist with their help, and therefore it would be loyal to them. It could never go against British imperial interests. They could never, they of course propped up their own dictatorial regimes that would help them advance their causes and so on and so forth. But those were much more unstable than a state that would be completely loyal because, again, it's settler colonial in its structure. So it would help them advance their various imperial interests in the region. The American empire slowly comes to that realization itself as it grew into its status as an empire after World War II. Of course, it was an empire before that, but it really became the superpower, the empire during the Cold War and certainly after. Israel showed its relevance and its importance to the American empire really during the Cold War. It helped it overthrow regimes, democratically elected regimes in Latin America. It was not just in the Middle East, right? Like, so when the Americans wanted a fascist, right-wing, a neoliberal government that would be open to American economic interests in South Africa, in Latin America, who would arm and train those regimes? It was the Israelis. This is so well known that Latin American scholars barely need citations to make this point when they make it, because it is so well understood that Israel played that role for American imperialism in Central and South America. Of course, it played that critical role in the region as a whole, whether it's providing intelligence, doing some of the dirty work of violence and so on for the American empire, defeating Soviet allied regimes or regimes in the Arab world that were kind of leaning towards the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of one of the critical ways in which Israel showed the Americans that they and the Americans are allied in self-interest. And to this day, the U.S. empire views Israeli settler colonialism as a critical imperial outpost. In fact, it is so critical that look at what they are willing to do to protect it and to use it to reshape, the Middle East region. One of the things that the Biden administration really liked about Israel's plan after October 2023 is that it kept telling them, we're going to create a new security reality in the Middle East. And the U.S. believed that this was something that was needed, that they needed to strengthen their security apparatus in the region, that they wanted to create a new reality where the dictatorial post-colonial authoritarian regimes like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia, and Jordan would start to work out in the open in complete tandem with Israel in creating a security infrastructure that would secure American interests and prevent rivals from making inroads into the region. Namely, they're thinking about China, Iran, Russia, and so on. So, the ultimate reason for U.S. support and active participation in the genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza today is their own self-interests. They're not driven by guilt. I'm sorry, I know, Gavin, you mentioned that. I'm not denying that some individuals might feel these things, but as you're talking about as states, they're not driven by guilt. If the U.S. was driven by guilt, slavery and the end of slavery would have gone a very different way. What did the American state do after emancipation? Did they give resources back to the Black community, the emancipated Black community? Hell no, they did none of that. You know what they did? They gave them handbooks to tell them, now you owe us. Now you have to learn how to be good, hardworking Americans. Imagine that, the slave owners telling the slaves, you got to learn how to work. You've got to know how to talk to white people in a sensitive way. The white people are sensitive right now. They just lost their slaves, the poor things. So don't rub that in their face that you got your emancipation. Go check that out. It's in the handbooks that were, promoted by the U.S. government at the time. Bow down. Tell the white people, I strive to be better today than I was yesterday. Don't tell them I'm free. And then what followed after that was segregation and continued ghettoization of black life, and so on and so forth. This state is not, guided by guilt. This is silly. They're only guided by one thing: the generation of power and wealth. And that is still what drives their support for Israel. So where does the global South lies in this? And by the way, some people were mentioning that in the comments. Well, a lot of those people in Italy, in Canada, in the US, it's not like it's just the state that is self-interested and is willing to dehumanize others for their benefit. There's a lot of people who are those states. You keep telling us we're democracies, we're democracies. Okay, well then the state represents the majority of the people. And there are quite significant numbers of people who have convinced themselves of having these higher ideals, but in fact, they're acting in brutal, naked self-interest, dehumanizing others for their own benefit, material benefit. And that's, and states do that themselves too. They masquerade and conceal their naked, brutal self-interest with higher ideals that they don't actually stand up for. We've seen this tons in the European Empire. Don't forget the scramble for Africa. The colonization and brutal destruction of societies and civilizations across the African continent in the 19th century and into the early parts of the 20th century was done in the name of ending slavery. That's how silly these ideas are of European colonial modernity. But they do. A lot of people are convinced by this nonsense. So that's who you will meet on a regular day-to-day basis, who have passionate support for Israel, but are in fact masquerading their brutal, their naked self-interest, which has been pursued brutally under the guise of these higher ideals. And Zionism does this a lot through Christian Zionism these days too. At any rate, back to states. So where does the global South? Because I want to finish on this. Countries in the global South know. On some level, some explicit, some behind closed doors, and so on. But they know that U.S. imperialism is not on their side. That U.S. imperialism is something that diminishes freedom and liberation for the majority of the world's population. Even for those elites that are participating in that U.S. imperial structure, those elites from the global South, they know that they prefer a weaker American empire. Because that would allow them more room to maneuver themselves. So I think we need to start to talk to that a little bit more, unfortunately, because this world is still ultimately run by self-interest. We have to speak to it on some level. And I do think that making the point, the reality of the situation clear, that the Israeli settler colony acts as a crucial imperial outpost for the American empire. That is the source of a lot of the American empire's strength, is part of the problem of U.S. imperialism and white supremacy. And that therefore, if the global South wants to help themselves, deteriorate American imperialism, then they have a self-interest in decolonizing Palestine. It's that simple. A decolonial Palestine, where Palestinians and Israelis live in a decolonial system, not a two-state solution nonsense, but a decolonial system, would shift slowly and over decades, but would shift the Israelis from their positionality right now, which is agents of U.S. imperialism, to being part of the region. And that would weaken the U.S. imperial security infrastructure in the region, their economic global infrastructure even, and would open up an opportunity for the global South especially to collectively put pressure on U.S. imperialism. So my view is that to put pressure on U.S. imperialism, you need to put pressure on Israel. If you can help decolonize Palestine, you are helping decolonize this global imperial world order. And that's what it is. We've never lived under an international system of justice. We've not even lived on it under international system of international law. We haven't even done that. But we certainly have not lived under a system of international justice. And for us to get there, we cannot continue to follow the same old tired logics of colonial modernity that the US and Israel promote. And for an alternative world to emerge, I think decolonizing Palestine lies at the heart of that struggle. Without decolonizing Palestine, we are basically handing the US a victory and allowing them to continue to march towards a world that will continue to be governed by the logics of white supremacy and European colonial modernity. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Muhannad. A quick question before I turn it over to the chat and you as well. When you're talking about the Global South joining the decolonizing struggle, would you imagine embracing as well the Israeli society? I mean, there is some kind of shift of the narrative from coexistence to co-resistance. We have seen examples like the No Other Land, and historically, the history of anti-colonial organizing, there is a room of like joint struggle. Although the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy kind of is very pessimistic because he thinks that only a handful of the society in Israel can actually recognize Palestinians and to join any struggle of that sort. So what is your take on that? You muted again.
Who was it who should be unmuted now?
Muhannad, please.
Sorry, I was reading some of the questions in the comments. The question is about the shift from.
In other words, when you were talking about the global South contributing to the struggle for decolonizing Israel, do you see any room for joint struggle in Israel itself as a society?
Right now, no. It's a small minority within Israel that are even thinking about what I'm talking about. Basically, the Israeli state not only has gotten away with genocide for so long, but has been rewarded for it for so long that the majority of Israelis believe in the racist and colonial rhetoric that they promote and that they practice. They believe that they are righteous in all of it. They believe that Palestinians are not really human. They believe that it is the righteous thing to do to eliminate them, to end their existence and their story once and for all, and so on. The majority of Israelis are beyond dialogue at this point. So the only thing that can change it into that, you have to force them into that. And so that can only come through a pressure. Like I said, at this moment, they are being rewarded for their genocide, for their racist worldview, and so on. They're rewarded mostly by the West, but also by countries in the global South that continue to do business. And in fact, some of which have expanded their business with them over the last year. They keep looking at that going, oh, okay, well, yeah, so clearly nobody gives a shit about the Palestinians. We can continue to do what we can do, and we are right, and so on. So that needs to shift. And there's only two ways to shift it. You either go to war with them, or you place economic and political pressure on them. I mean, some people say you can do both. I prefer the political and economic pressure. If the global South collectively today says, that's it, we're cutting off all economic and diplomatic and political ties with Israel, and they do it as a collective bloc, that will put enormous pressure on both Israel and the US. The genocide would stop literally tomorrow. But the world would not be able to stop the isolation just because the actual genocidal operation stopped. It would have to say, we're going to stop this until all Palestinians have the right to return. And so, like, we're talking about real decolonization. If they do that, you can then pressure Israelis into switching their position. And what would happen is that you're going to, just like you had in South Africa, in French in Algeria, you're going to have the hardcores of Israelis that will go, well, if that's the reality, if I have to live with Palestinians, I'm out of here. And to those people, I say, ma salame, goodbye. Go to wherever you want to go and be racist somewhere else. But you're not welcome to stay in a decolonized Palestine. For those Israelis that make transformation, they're more than welcome to stay and live with Palestinians as equals. But to get there, you have to put serious pressure. And serious pressure, in my view, can only come through political and economic isolation. Right now, the majority of the global South will tell you things like, well, let's say if you go to South Africa, where you have, a very friendly government and has done a lot for Palestinians, but they've not cut economic ties with Israel. They're still doing business with Israel. If you go to them right now and you go, why can't you cut that economic tie? You can survive without it. You can replace Israel with someone else to, buy your coal or go sell your diamonds to get them, whatever they call them, cut your diamonds and all of that. You can find other places for that. And they'll say, sure, but the Americans will come even harsher on us if we do something like that. They're afraid of the American punishment. Same with Turkey, same with a lot of countries. So to me, okay, well then work together. If Turkey, South Africa, Colombia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, God forbid, a couple of European countries like Ireland, Norway, if they all got together and announced it on the same day, what are the Americans going to do? They're not going to punish them all. Indonesia, Malaysia, these are big economies. The Americans will not be wanting to risk ruining their relationship altogether with all those countries for one imperial outpost. They'll start to do the pros cons calculation and go, it's not worth it. So it has to be a collective effort by the global South, and preventing the Americans from being able to pick apart each state individually, which is what they're currently doing. So there's safety in numbers, and that sort of action can then again place enough pressure on Israeli society that it starts to transform. It's gonna take some decades, what I'm talking about, to get to a real decolonial space. But it has to start some point. And if it's not starting now, I don't know when.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think you already answered some of the questions that were posted in the chat, and there were some for Diana as well, but unfortunately she had to leave. I'm sorry we started a little bit later than expected. If anyone wants to take any of the questions that are otherwise, I will just, I guess, prioritize, and whoever question came first. So there was a question. The first question I see here is if Hamas was aware of this deep and long-standing dehumanization of Palestinians, how come that they undertook the operation of October 23 if they should have been aware that the wave of dehumanization would be facilitated by this act? Wasn't this not only suicidal, but also self-subverting? And to you, Muhannad, I'm afraid there are all too many people who stay with Israel not out of interest, but out of pure supremacism and civilizational solidarity, pro-West sentiments. That's more of a comment, I guess.
Well, I kind of saw those two comments about self-interest and people meeting people that are, but again, people who are motivated by white supremacy and all. I mean, that's self-interest. So the story of European colonialism, like I said, is one that said one thing and did something that was the complete opposite of it. Like I said, just to go back to the example of the colonization of all of Africa, it was done in the name of ending slavery, bringing prosperity, and enhancing commerce. And of course, all they did was destroy those three things among everything else. And it was all done really for the generation of power and wealth for the European empires. Now, that's not to say that there was people within that acted for the empire even that believed that nonsense. They thought they were there to end slavery and promote commerce and bring civilization. But it doesn't matter what they think. It doesn't matter what's in their hearts. It's what you do that matters. We do that in our interpersonal relationships all the time. If someone you are working with or have a friendship with or whatever that tells you one thing and then does something completely other, how long is that person staying in your life? Not for very long. Why? Because you don't trust that person and you go, well, that they're not who they say they are. Who they really are is what they do. It's the same thing here. Most people are not going to tell you, yes, I want to kill everyone from the Palestinians and I think I'm a superior human being. They're not going to come out and say that because human beings for the most part want to think of themselves as good, but their actions are what defines what is good and what is bad, not what they say about themselves. So there are many things, and some people are aware of the fact that they're lying to you and to themselves, and some people are not. But people ask me, like, well, is this person doing this and that? I don't know, and I don't care. The effect of what they say is the same, which is to continue the dehumanization of Palestinians. So again, you're going to come across those people, and Christian Zionism has played a huge role in providing cover and moral justification for what are unjustifiable acts. Now, in terms of the first part of the question, I'm not part of Hamas. I'm not here to speak for them. They can answer that question themselves. That question has been debated quite a lot, by the way, in the among Palestinians, in Arab media, and so on. People still have different views on, their views of like. Did Hamas miscalculate? Did they understand things? Was it a suicidal mission? And so on and so forth. These things are still kind of murky because the thing is still ongoing. Many of the people who were in those rooms to debate these questions, I assume many of them some of them for sure are dead. The leaders have been killed, and I'm sure many others. So I don't know. I don't know the answer. Obviously, they were out. Every Palestinian is aware of their dehumanization. That's not part of it. But by most accounts, it seems that the calculation that Hamas made was that Saudi normalization is just around the corner. And if that happens, it's done. It's done. Nobody's going to listen to the Palestinians. We are erased, and people are going to go along with that. We need to do something spectacular to bring Palestine back to the forefront of the map, the political discussion. Some have argued that there was a faction within Hamas that kind of made this decision behind the backs of others. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. Some have said, and this one does seem to have a lot of people saying that this happened, is that they did not think it would go the way it went. They thought they would be maybe able to kind of just, quickly breach the wall and then back in, maybe go to one settlement or one post, grab a few soldiers as hostages and go right back in. That they lost control of it seems to be pretty accurate. But at any rate, people will continue to debate the political calculation that Hamas made and whether it was its faults and so on for many years to come. But the bottom line is that Israel used this as a pretext. It's not like Israel was not already on a path of creating Greater Israel and establishing exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty from the river to the sea. They were already on that path. They saw this opportunity as an opportunity to enact this plan on a grand, violent scale because they thought, well, now is the time to do it. And they still think that way.
Thank you. And thank you, Gavin, for answering one of the questions here in the chat. Maybe we can take a few more if you have time. We are over time. So another one has to do with actually the purpose of this group, so I will raise it. Thanks to everyone for their illuminating presentations. I would like to hear from each of you about the importance and possible new directions of artistic creation, intervention in and with the larger struggle for Palestinian and global liberation. And maybe, Gavin, you can chime in with examples from South Africa. You are muted.
Yeah, okay, no, I'm no longer muted. Well, I mean, in South Africa, there was a very significant number, obviously a small minority, but still a significant number of white people who were not just active in anti-apartheid activities, but who basically supported the liberation struggle in one way or another. And one of those was a group called the End Conscription Campaign, which I was involved in. And that was obviously opposed to military conscription. You weren't allowed to encourage people to become conscientious objectors. That was against the law. But so we then campaigned for a change in the law of conscription. And we got young white conscripts who all faced with military service, but we got much larger numbers of people because their families and their brothers and their sisters and so on. And so we had about 1,000 activists in that organization, and we put on a lot of cultural activities relating to opposing the military. So we did a music album. We built sandcastles on the beach. We did agitprop theater and things like that. And I think it created a momentum. I mean, it's been very encouraging that in Israel they've also been a movement much smaller, I think, than existed in South Africa, but against military conscription. And I think what is perhaps more encouraging in the longer term was the number of Jewish students in the United States who were involved in the pro-Palestinian protests. And I mean, even though Donald Trump has very successfully squashed those with his pressure on the American universities, I think there's a kind of groundswell of opposition to Israel among young people in the United States, which I think when those people get older and they reach positions of power, say within the Democratic Party, could change the momentum, could change the direction, or at least gradually shift it in a direction that is at least more critical of Israel and more inclined to recognize the Palestinian people.
Thank you. Muhannad, would you like to add anything about that?
I mean, I just want to say in general, I understand there's going to be a lot of artists here. The critical part or role that art can continue to play is to fight against the erasure of Palestinians and the real story of Palestine. Is to fight against the censorship that Diana talked about in her talk. Is to find and to do that by finding alternative ways of funding. I remember when I was in South Africa, I was in Cape Town around this time last year, and met a group of young artists, all Black South Africans, and they mentioned that the silence on Palestine within that community was due to the fact that a lot of them depended on funding from Zionist organizations or organizations that tended to have a Zionist leaning within South Africa and internationally from the US. So they were afraid for their livelihood. And so, as I said before, your oppression in that scenario is tied to the oppression of Palestinians. And therefore, your liberation from those funding agencies that dictate what you can and can't do is tied to the liberation of Palestinians. So I encourage artists everywhere to resist the censorship, to resist the erasure of Palestine, to continue to speak about Palestine and the Palestinian struggle and Palestinian aspirations for freedom and liberation. To tie that to their own aspirations for freedom and liberation, to connect their own struggles with the Palestinian struggle wherever you are in the world. There's many people, of course, in the global north that do that too, and for good reason. Basically, as Diana mentioned before we started, Palestine right now has a prime minister, a vice president, or whatever. I don't even know the titles anymore, and no state. We are a stateless people, and our source of power is our people power, and we depend on other people power everywhere to push for changes in the political system. And I know there was a question about, like, how can we do, what can we as people do to affect policy and these big things happening on big stages? You do what you can within your scope, within your surrounding. If you're an artist, continue to push, teach, display art, create art that centers Palestinians, that invites Palestinian artists to join you in your projects and initiatives. That's how you create a change of consciousness among the population that will hopefully at some point filter up towards policymaking and puts pressure on policymaking. We use the tools that we have, limited as they are, as people power. And when these tools entirely fail, then at least call that out. Just say, okay, well, we don't live in the democracy we thought we did. At least let's be upfront. Just be honest, and see if and if people are okay with that, people are okay with that. But if people want to change their own systems to make them more democratic, that's hopefully where this will go. So it's a slow and a long struggle. The Palestinian people have been struggling for over 100 years. I know the Palestinian people will be ready to go for 100 more and more than that if needed. I just hope people around the world are as well.
Thank you, thank you. Maybe just to add two specific examples that I saw in the chat, in one of the comments and questions you already answered, one of our attendees is hinting that BDS only had limited success. So I wonder, what is your take on that? The BDS movement that is actually very, popular among artists. And also another attendee mentions that's about the joint struggle, groups like Yesh Din and Ayyash B'Tselem, and breaking the silence, whether they matter or not. And I guess we do not have much more time for any other questions, but both Gavin and Muhannad are welcome to make any final comments.
Gavin, would you like to go first, and then I'll finish it?
Yeah, look, I mean, in one sense, it's been the number of people in Israel who are able or willing to take a pro-Palestinian stance is very small. But I think that there have been some encouraging steps that I've seen, and some of those have been in dialogue with people, for example, in South Africa, who were opposed to apartheid, with people in Ireland. So I don't think it's entirely negative. And I think the point you made, that as things become more intense for Israel, if they do, it's likely that kind of opposition, whether cultural or directly political, is very likely to grow, as it is among Jewish people all over the world.
Yeah, so just very quickly, I know to the comment from Dimitar, far from self-destructive or doomed. If that's your interpretation, then I think you have to have a self-reflection about why you believe that. I presented the reality of the situation, and then this is when you have to have that reality and honesty in your evaluation of the context before you take action. But it's not to say, oh, it's all self-interest and it's over. In fact, I laid out what the self-interest of the global South is. To actually act against, and how we can talk to the self-interest of the global South. And by the way, many European countries that also despise US imperialism and want it weakened, and what their self-interest is in this case. And the only solution is BDS and support for BDS. So I encourage everyone to create BDS groups if there aren't none in your communities, to join them where they already exist, to push it in your institutions, participate in it as an individual. You can do that right away. stop consuming from Israeli certainly from Israeli companies, but other companies that have been named by the BDS campaign that are up for boycott. Placing that economic and political pressure on Israel, on Israeli society, is a critical part of this equation. They will not change unless they are pressured into change. They're not going to all of a sudden come up and say what we're doing is wrong. They've had over 75 years to do that. They haven't. They've had a year and a half of the most brutal genocide you've ever seen in your life, and they haven't. They can only be changed through pressure. And once they're changed through pressure, they can become part of the solution. But right now, they are the problem. And that has to be communicated clearly. And it's nowhere near enough of them have changed. So the way that, and those who have changed are telling you, I support BDS because that's the only way to change my fellow Israelis. Those protests that you're saying they're against Netanyahu, they want hostages back, after which they are more than happy to continue with the genocide. That's been shown in polls. So there's no change coming from within Israeli society. There's no change coming from within American society either. The Global South needs to really step up in this historical moment and take a leading role in changing and transforming the current direction that we're going into, not just in Palestine, but on a global stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both. And here is a question I think I'm afraid I missed about Israel being seen as a liability than an asset to the United States and other Western powers. What is your take on that?
Just very quickly, because we're definitely over time now, but just very quickly, I disagree with Mearsheimer on some of his arguments. Of course, the lobby is a very strong lobby. So his analysis of it and its workings, absolutely no argument with him there. I think his framing is misled. I think he is trying to, and has always been, trying to push a particular political path through his framing. What I mean by that is the Israeli lobby cannot create self-interest for the US out of thin air. It's not like they fooled the Americans into thinking that Israel is good for them. Americans are not that stupid. Even the Trump administration is not that stupid. They look at things very rationally, very coldly. They calculate. They make mistakes. They're human. So don't get me wrong on that. I'm not saying, people assume, rational, cold-hearted calculation always leads to efficient result. It doesn't. But that is still definitely present within the American administrations, regardless of what you think of Trump and all of that. That's still present even there. Again, they're making mistakes and all of that, no question there, but it's still there. So my point is that they're not just being fooled by the Israelis for over 40, 50 years, 60 years or something like that. They've made the calculation that it is in their self-interest to support Israeli settler colonialism in the region. Now, where the Israeli lobby is critical is that there is a strong stand. There used to be a strong strand within American foreign policy circles, especially in the 60s and 70s, maybe even into the 80s, that argued, no, the best path for achieving American imperial interests, they were still imperialists. Of course, they never used the word imperialism, but, they are. The best path for American imperial interests in the region is not Israel, is the authoritarian Arab regimes. We're doing okay with them. Why are we sticking our necks out for this settler colony that is hated by the people in the region and whose hate is going to transfer onto us and make our lives difficult in a lot of ways? This is the quote-unquote Arabist path. Mearsheimer belongs to that path, although I don't think he's an imperialist. But anyway, it's kind of like he's basically saying, that path is better for America. In a different way, but anyway, I don't want to get into his own thinking, and because it's not about him. So what the Israel's lobby's main function, in my view, is, and I've written about this in a journal article, is that it stops that Arabist path from becoming strong in American foreign policy. That's what they fear the most. is that America would calculate, you know what, we're better off putting all our eggs in the basket with the authoritarian Arab regimes, not Israel. If that happens, Israel would not be able to do the genocide that it's doing, its expansion into the West Bank, annexation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where I see the role of the Israel lobby. So the Israel lobby, it plays a critical role in censorship, in erasure of Palestine. You know, anybody that sticks their head out anywhere in politics, culture, academia, business, sports, whatever, and speaks a little bit and has a wide audience and so on, and can reach people, can affect people's consciousness and so on, they attack and try to censor so that you know, that Arabist path never emerges as a serious threat to the current path that the U.S. empire is on. But the U.S. empire clearly knows that its imperial interests are aligned with Israeli settler colonialism. They're not being fooled by the Israeli state. Now, whether it is from a rational perspective a liability or not, that is an open debate, certainly. So I'm not trying to downplay that, even for the purposes of ensuring American interests. But you know, it is a debate. Israel can go to the Americans and make a good case why they're not a liability and that they are an advantage. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, and I'm actually glad that we allowed more time to touch on more points and issues. And thank you so much, Muhannad, Gavin, and Diana, who unfortunately had to leave a little bit earlier for prior engagement at the university.